7 generations. What is this going to look like for the 7th generation from you?
Wow.
That if you're not thinking that far ahead, you're just thinking of immediate gratification and ego.
Wow.
You're not thinking of the legacy that you're leaving for generations. Are they going to have clean water? Are they going to have, what are the ramifications for them from the decisions that you make today?
Talking about ramifications, I listened to Joe Rogan with Sadhguru on this past week, and Sadhguru's doing this global tour about soil, and his points are bang on. Like, it's scientific. This isn't a holy man. This is actually probably one of the better equipped holy men out there. But he said we've basically got maybe 40 years before it's game over for humans and life forms, because we are depleting the organic content in soil and not putting any organic content back into the soil. He said, I think 80% of all critical living entities in soil are on the top 8 inches. Yet the equipment that these large farming organizations and companies are using go down 12 inches, and they're destroying that critical, he broke it down, forget the chemicals and the pesticides and all of that stuff. But it's like, you don't understand that this is integral to everything. You get rid of the soil, you kill the soil. The problem is we've called it dirt, and it's dirty, and it's dirt, when really it's not. We've misunderstood it. The values of walking barefooted on grass or on soil, the connection between us, the energy of what's below us. To ground something is to earth it. It's terminology used by electricians and technologists. Yet we've somehow forgotten about that. And 7 generations, we barely think about one.
Right? We were doing that with every single decision that we made. And some of those were far-reaching. We had one of the caremongering groups in Malaysia was a group of Myanmar refugees who had been forced out of Burma, and they had gone to Bangladesh. And it was war that forced them out, and then they were in this refugee encampment, and they got flooded. So with the monsoon rains, and they had to leave, and they had these tiny little boats, and they ended up in Malaysia, and they ended up in a jungle. And because none of the cities wanted to take them, they were overrun, and they just said, we're going to put you out here. They had 2 days left of food. There were 78 men in there, and no money, no transportation, and they were very close to running out of water, clean drinking water. And somebody had been traveling past there, found them, and said they've only got 2 days food left and no way of getting more, and there's no towns within 2 days walk anywhere. So the group got food to them, and then they told us of an orphanage, and there were 68 babies under the age of 2 who had run out of formula that day.
Wow.
No rice, no milk. And it's that precarious. It's that precarious for that many people. One storm away, one fire away. In BC, our group was dealing with getting food out with the landslides, with the highways being cut off. They couldn't get food to the spaces between because it was mountain on one side, ocean on the other, and the landslides cutting off bits and pieces of the road. They couldn't get help. We are so close to disaster on multiple fronts, economic, on Earth.
Yeah.
We're fucked.
Yeah.
If we don't start pulling together.
Yeah. What's preventing us, Harry, from pulling together?
I would say ego at personal levels, and a mass ego, and a perpetuation of that mass ego at a global level. Because, like you mentioned, the Kardashians, they represent the elite. We're living in this imaginative world where something unattainable can be attainable for everybody. But then the only thing that's going to separate you and the next one is your demeanor, your meanness, really. everything that we're going towards in society is looking at things destructively. It takes people to step back, and you have to have a ton of these small voices eventually connecting, because otherwise it's not going to happen.
You know, we talk about education and the importance of talking about real education. Let's talk the inner journey as, let's call it the real education. Because if there is such a organization or a TV presence like the Kardashians, and you know, we've got nothing against them individually, we're just using them as a great example. But see, there doesn't seem to be anyone in media that's asking those questions which are making people raise their eyebrows and go, oh, hold on, I never thought about that. Oh, hold on, I never realized that I don't need to look a certain way or behave a certain way or wear a particular brand in order for me to somehow be happy, because it doesn't equal happiness. It equals instant happiness of, oh my God, I have those shoes that I wanted. But it's not prolonged. Prolonged, we're agreeing, comes from within. It comes from giving. It comes from helping. It comes from making a difference for the right reasons, not for being an elite or being selfish. So if we were to say, who is responsible for that? You know, because it has to be like a tsunami globally, where you're suddenly changing the narrative to say, I say in my book, I'm like, don't put people on pedestals, ladies and gentlemen, because you put them on pedestals and then you're typically the ones that knock them off. And guess what? You're going to fall when you get kicked off a pedestal. You're going to feel the bumps. You're going to get the bruises and the scars. Don't do that. Why do we put people on pedestals? No, they're just like you and I. They have to get up and probably have to, you know, do a number 2 just like you and I. They have to brush their teeth just like you and I. They have to wash their faces and what we call sleep from the corner of their eye, just like you and I. Yet we have to kind of say, yes, it's kind of nice and it's cool that somebody's famous, but fame, like we said earlier, Will Smith said, that doesn't give you anything. That's the real substance in life. And so how do we change the conversation around elitism? How do we change the conversation around mass egos and individual egos? For me, it's an education. It's a, you know, I've been asked to come to a secondary school in the Peel region and speak to both teachers and the students. And I'm so looking forward to it because I haven't spoken to school children for maybe over a decade. But I really want to push on and create an approach to speaking to the children which is slightly different to the one when I speak to the teachers. But I want to try and engage with them to say, look, you know, school and college and university are here to provide you to open your mind. But there is another type of education that opens your mind. And you must all pursue it individually. You have to do it individually because there is no system in place, I feel, today that provides that education. So it is an individual's journey. But how do we try and make it into an institution? How do we try and make this thing global where it's a no-brainer that people are learning those things? Because they used to. We used to in the Punjab. They did in Japan. They did in China. They did in other parts of the world. When you hear about what was being taught in these very literate communities, it wasn't just science and technology and literature. It was living a happy and a content life.
I think part of that is the connectedness, that all of those communities taught a person's connectedness to their immediate environment, to what we were just talking about, the soil that they walk on, the water that they drink. How are you connected? How are you responsible to? And when we lose sense of that, we place the emphasis on something else and invariably put it on a pedestal, and what we put on a pedestal isn't healthy. And we're not connected to it. There's no connection. There's no personal connection. There's no sense of responsibility if things go awry. Yeah. Whereas when you're connected to the spaces around you and you're responsible to your neighbor, you're responsible to the animals, to your food supply, to your water, you make a point of maintaining a sense of purity about it. And about yourself, because that responsibility, you have to be worthy of your environment.
Let's carry on with the pedestal analogy. For me, the story of our first beloved guru, Guru Nanak, and the big rock boulder, like, for it to be an analogy of something else, I'll listen to that every day. For it to be no, it actually happened, this 5-ton boulder or this 2-ton boulder was thrown down and he stopped it with such force that his handprint has been embedded into the rock face. And not only is it embedded, if you were to shear away the face of where his handprint is, it keeps going deeper in. I roll my eyes and I say, that's not what we need to be teaching the next generation. That story, if it had, and the moral of the story is, I get it. But that to me is Disney, it's fantasy, it's for me, I'd rather hear about how he fed the fakirs and the holy men with the money he was given. It's a story maybe, it may not be factual. I'd rather hear how he's probably the second most traveled person in the world ever, crisscrossing China, Tibet, Persia, all over India. And I think not only sharing knowledge, but obtaining knowledge as well. Like, I want my gurus to be real. I don't want, I'll tell you a story, and I mention it in my book. I used to say to my dad, I'm born now, but Jesus came 2,000 years ago. Guru Nanak came 500 years ago. Muhammad came, Buddha came, Ram came. I'm here now. It's no good me listening to these or reading these stories and reading this. I need to experience them now. And my dad said, which may have led me down to the fake fakir chapter, that souls and souls like them are always on this planet. And some get identified and some don't. And so I think from a young age, I was in search of wanting to meet these deeper people. Listen, none of my gurus and your gurus wanted to be put on these pedestals. None of them did. None of them did. We put them on pedestals. And now we've expanded the stories to suddenly make them 20 foot tall instead of 5'6" or 5'7", the average height maybe at that time. We've created these mythologies which there is some purpose of somebody walking on water or from a woven basket feeding the 20,000 or the 10,000, I can't remember the story. But people start to embrace that as absolute. You go to a church and they will say it absolutely and utterly happened as it says in the Bible. And you go to a Gurdwara and they will say, no, Guru Nanak for sure stopped that rock with his hand. I'm saying, and he did, and it is beneficial to you and me. How? That question. And so I think we need to look at that education of peeling away like an onion all of those layers and getting to the core of what is it that we need to be teaching the next generation. What universal language and content can we provide them where, as they're being taught ABC because it's a universal language, at the same time we're saying, look, these are the things in life which are good and these are the things in life which aren't good. And your happiness will always be connected to giving, my child. So when I give you 2 chocolate mini bars to take to school, I give you 2, my child, because I want to make sure you give one away. Not that you eat both of them. And I would like you to give one to a different child every day. And then when I can give you 3, I want you to have that same practice. So they begin to understand at a young age that it's not selfishness or it's not me. And then suddenly their ego's now being checked to be like, hold on, whatever I'm given is to be shared as opposed to be obtained. I think it sounds maybe naive, but I think we need to be having these conversations and seeing how we can change education.
We absolutely do. I look at kids and see how they give and how they share. And I think it's something that they do intuitively. I was reading on your Facebook, on your little one, giving when you weren't watching, and they didn't know that they were being watched. And I think as adults, it's us who stop that. I think we teach selfishness
100%.
by withholding, by telling them that there isn't enough or this is all, and we place those
We do.
restrictions and we teach them how to be selfish.
And why do we do that? Is it because we lack the education and understanding and knowledge, or is it societal? Is it the concept of there's not enough when we know there's an abundance of everything?
I think it comes from fear. That it's fear of, if I don't teach you this, you're going to have to go through the hard stuff. You're going to have to go through the bullies. That you're going to have to be self-reliant to deal with that awful world out there. And for that not to happen, I need to toughen you up and make it not hurt. And I think it comes from a place of hurt, actually, that we teach this to our children because we don't want them to face the same hurt that we faced. So we make them resistant to it, but we do it in such a way that we teach them selfishness rather than self-awareness.
Wow. Selfishness rather than self-awareness. I think we have an opportunity. It takes years, they say, to change an education system. Yet, at high school level, I was in Windsor, Ontario, when the $5 billion announcement of LG making batteries for EV cars was announced, which is, by the way, phenomenal news for Canada. And I got to speak with some of the seniors and the deans of St. Clair College there, and they said, we'd already been talking to them around cybersecurity, and they said, we are going to be launching 11 or 13 new courses this September. And I was like, that's fantastic. And so it seems like there is an opportunity at a college or a university level to be able to pivot and move within 3 to 5 years. But the question is how do we collectively, let's just say there's 3 or 4 of us here, but let's say we've got to expand the conversation to say, who do we talk to try and make a change in the curriculum of what children in, let's say if it's provincially driven, in Ontario are taught. And again, it should be from that younger age. Like today, we grew up at a period where there were derogatory comments made about a certain person's choice of, sexuality and their choice of, which path they were going to go down. We grew up with those negative comments as normal. We called them each other because it was the way it was. But today, through education, we know it's wrong. My daughter came home and she tells us how one of her friends is, bisexual, and another one is somebody in their class is a lesbian and everything. And she's openly having those conversations with us, and our responses are very much, yeah, okay, as opposed to, what? How dare, don't you ever, you've got to run the other way, you've got to hide, don't look at her, she'll, like nonsense that may have come from our parents' generation, maybe. For us, it's like, yeah, and
our poor parents. Like, this wouldn't have hit them if their bloody books hadn't been burnt, because they would have learned that 2 generations before them, this was normal.
This was normal.
So there's this awesome term called kutta in Punjabi, and
in English, what does that mean?
it means like dogs going at it.
Okay.
And the thing is, when they'd say it to guys, I thought it was just them calling guys dogs, but I was told that that's a colloquial term for going to a whorehouse. So when they say "O kutte kam karta hai," that's a mom's way of letting everybody know that my son's now out there.
Yeah.
So kind of watch your daughters.
Wow.
You see, this is the type of coded language that's actually there, and every few villages had a whorehouse. And even within Gurbani, they've got the story of Ganaka, and she was a prostitute. But the thing is, right in front of you, it's there. But the problem is the lens that we're taking towards approaching things, because it gets back to the connectedness. You can know everything in silos, and that's adding to the selfishness. But to be self-aware, you also have to be aware of everything around you and be open to understanding how it's impacting you. That conversation you just mentioned, did we get this from our parents? And then your answer, our poor parents. Because it's like, yeah, we've processed that, we've understood it. But you know what? They're subject to the same stuff we're subject to. And that trauma was different in its own way.
Each generation of trauma removes from the collective whole. And which is why I'm really glad that you're giving to the charities that you're giving to, because we need to look at healing that trauma. It's unaddressed. We're not talking about a lot of it. My parents lived through two different traumas because my mom lived through partition and then through Idi Amin. And it was, I don't know which was worse. I lived through Idi Amin, and the things that I remember, no child should have to live with that. No child should have to remember that kind of trauma.
Yeah.
And when it's left unaddressed, it festers. It creates that constant feeling of what's going to happen next. Can it happen again? And you're always on edge because trauma travels through generations the same way that when you're thinking 7 generations ahead, that's how far ahead trauma travels as well.
Is it traveling through DNA? Is it traveling through energy? Is it being transplanted through a parent to its or her child?
I think all of it, because when a mother is breastfeeding, whatever she's feeling is being transferred in hormonal form to 100%. The infant. They're aware of what music is because they're listening to it in the womb. They're aware of what trauma is because they've experienced it in a visceral way before they were even born. And then they're passing that on genetically as well.
And back to Soch mental health, there are conversations we must have as a community. I don't like having rugs in my house, and I hate to put things underneath the rug. Transparency in a household, transparency in relationships, transparency with self. It's again back to the masks. You're removing layers. You're trying to, find that thing which is really you, as opposed to, oh, that's not really me. That's just me at work, and that's me at home, and that's me in front of my friends.
Can we talk about the elephant in the room?
Yeah, please.
Because one of the things that we don't talk about and that you brought up in your book is sexual assault and how it infiltrates within religious institutions. I refuse to step foot in a Gurdwara for that very reason. That unless it's a wedding or a funeral, I won't go in there. I was assaulted by somebody connected with a Gurdwara. And when we don't talk about it, when we don't have those supports available to communicate about it, what ended up happening is that I got ostracized.
Yeah.
Not my offender.
Yeah.
Not the one who did this, not the perpetrator. I got pushed out of the community for not being, for bringing it up.
For bringing it up.
Because why would you talk about that?
And it's not just one case, Mita. There are so many other cases, and it's ongoing. Yet somehow, like I made a comment on social media, and it was taken the wrong way because my comment was because there were things appearing last year in the UK. I think Derby or some other areas, some Godore, and I made a comment about this is not who we are. Meaning, oh my God, like I thought we as a community and as a people. We don't look, my mom there's just me and my brother. We've got no sisters. And the education was very clear. She's younger than you. She's your sister, same age. She's older. She's like a mother, all of that. That's how it was. When the fake fakir raped the girl he raped, she was not my relative. She was not my family. She was somebody who I had seen and treated like a sister. And so my mom and dad, like when this blew up, my parents didn't say, no, 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 stay home. Like, just, it's okay, forget about it. He did it. My mom and dad both were like, Guru Gobind Singh said, Sach te karnaya ta sach te marnaya. You stand for truth and you die for truth. Go do what you got to do. As opposed to, oh my God, like, no, 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 just... And so for me, the right thing to do is to defend her and to do whatever we could. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned in my book, but she's today living in Canada, practicing as a nurse with 2 wonderful children and a new life, because we owed her that. But my comment on social media was about this is who we are, meaning we're better than this. And some people are like, well, you need to get your head out of the sand, mate, because this is what's going on. I'm like, listen, I'm not saying it's not. I am just disgusted that it is, because maybe I was naive to think that we weren't predators, but we're all predators. Because as soon as you try and take sexuality and do this to it, or as soon as you have trauma, let's say, by being abused, like we were talking, I think just before this podcast, we were talking about doing another podcast on serial killers. And serial killers don't just fall from the sky. There is possibly abuse and trauma and things that they've witnessed and lived through, which have affected them, and then suddenly made them to think, well, this is what I'm doing is the right thing for these particular reasons. And so we do, as a community, need to talk about the elephant in the room. We so do need to talk about this.
And we need to talk about not only the elephant in our own room, but in our neighbors' rooms.
Absolutely.
In our community rooms, that we are interconnected.
So how do we do it though, Mita? So for example, because I remember you sharing this with me a few years ago. So what should we be doing as a community, like on this? Should there be a podcast, for example, with focused on this? Because I've listened to hundreds of podcasts, I'm sure both of you have. I've not heard one where people from our community are talking specifically about this.
There was a film that I went to go see at the Real World Film Festival, and it was talking about sexual violence, and it was a group of six in the audience primarily. There was maybe 2 or 3 non-Sikhs in there. Mm-hmm. And there was a Q&A with the filmmaker at the end of it. And I watched who was getting up and standing up in the line. And it was almost all men. And I was with somebody who was not from our community who said, oh, this is not going to be good. It's all the men talking. And I said, no. This is as it should be. This is exactly how it should be. And I said, just sit back and watch for a second. And every single man who stood up there said pretty well the same thing. That we don't like that this is happening in our community. We don't like that women are feeling unsafe in our community because of behavior done by our brothers. Mm-hmm. So how are we going to address it as men? And that conversation made me feel safer than any number of feminist-held conversations in the liberal world that were held with the victims coming up with the solutions. It should be the men coming up with, how do we change the culture Absolutely. Of how we talk to each other, of what we enable with our language, what we condone with our silences. That how do we check our own brothers and say, hey, you've had too much to drink. You're being an asshole. Yeah. You might want to sit this one out. That when you start doing that, it makes it safer for us.
At what point does a man, though, again, maybe it's naive, at what point does a man think he has the right to lay a hand on a human being, a female, or a male? What creates that situation? What does he do? Is it substance abuse, whether it's alcohol, whether it's other substances? Is it trauma because there was a pattern at home? We all know, we've all come from Punjabi families where alcohol flows like rivers. And our parents' generation, I had uncles that used to beat the living daylights out of my aunties because they didn't bring something as quick as they wanted when they were completely drunk. And so, like, what's created this? Like, why is it happening? Because it's more than just substance abuse. It's more than just situations happening at home where somebody feels that they can actually lay a hand onto somebody else.
I think if we go back to the American slave trade, and they traded in human bodies that they brought from Africa, and when they wanted to have control over them, what they did was bring in other immigrants from places like Scotland and
Ireland.
Yeah. And said, you are going to watch over them. They created that middle person. And that middle person, they were being treated like shit by the same people that the blacks were.
Yeah.
But by creating that tension between the two of them and saying, you are above them, it gave them an excuse to punish somebody lower. And I think with a lot of our men under colonialism, that being made to feel inferior, being made to feel less than, and then with those book burnings, the literacy from women in particular was decimated.
Yeah.
So it created a secondary class of lower citizen. And if the men were a lower class of people, the women were even lower. And this was encouraged and promoted because then it allowed for that mindset to proliferate. And in order to get out of that, we have to decolonize our minds. And we have to decolonize in a way that we start seeing each other as equals again.
I want to just give some history behind that, which is interesting. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he was mentioned earlier, last king of Punjab. He was secular, although he came from a Sikh mindset, but that mindset was secular. He had Europeans in his court. He had the most amazing courtesans, etc., etc. In his time, he made sure every village had a book called Punjabi Qaeda, and every woman was taught to read for that. Again, it gets back to the epistemes. As soon as you start decimating people and getting at them in different ways, they have to adjust to the trauma, and it continues and continues and continues to a point that your way is such a far ideal that you actually have that Stockholm syndrome, thinking they're the people that actually have that. But the only reason it's familiar is because it's cultivated in you. But I find people in those privileged positions often don't have that empathy because they can't relate. It's that isolationism getting compounded with materialism.
It's a, this elephant in the room, the lack of inner journey, voyages, all of this stuff, again, it's education, right? It's all down to what was educated, what isn't taught, what was understood, what is misunderstood, what was brought on. It was only maybe less than a decade ago that I learned about how, American slave owners, or let's say the Western Hemisphere, British as well, used the Bible and the story of Noah and Noah's children to justify slavery, because they said one of Noah's children, the one that was banished into, they said, well, what had to be Africa, and the good book, or the good old book, says they were banished and they would always be like the slaves of. And so, hey, the good book, that's who we're only bringing over Noah's descendants, and the good book tells us that we can, because look, this is where it was like. And look, times change, people change, culture changes, but that was always wrong. To bring people over and to treat them the way they were was always wrong. How Indians were treated around 1913, 1914, and the Bengal famines, which were instigated by Sir Winston Churchill, to say, no, make sure that food is making its way to Europe and to the UK, and not to those people. So food grown in India was being pulled from the hands of Indians, particularly in the Bengali, and millions lost their lives to famine. We're talking, at the same time, Indians are on the forefront, on the front lines, fighting for the empire. We really do need to revisit this global conversation of education and how it's got to change, because it's wrong on so many levels. And society, though, the positive is society has now come to a point where we can talk about sexuality openly. We can talk about choices that individuals make openly. We can talk about mental health openly. That is a positive here in 2022. But I still think an opportunity is there for us to help to reset how and what is educated, and at what age do we start to introduce that.
Hey, the beautiful thing is that some books are made to subjugate us, and I think our liberation lies equally in books, in knowledge, in using that intellect to counter that.
And could I say, in movies and in pictures and in the moving pictures, because I think people read books, but the old saying, a picture paints 1,000 words. For me, in the book, I'm a huge fan of Malcolm X. When I broke away from the fake fakir, there was a young fella who's now a podcaster who used to do a blog back when Harry and I first met. And he said, look, I know this Kulbir guy because he was my teacher at the Gurdwara. This guy's a bit like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. And he goes, this guy would have taken a bullet for this fake fakir at a point. And so for him to say something's wrong, I'm going to believe him if something is wrong. And I was like, who's this Malcolm X guy? I'm from the UK. I kind of knew about him and the civil rights movement. Didn't know enough, started to read upon him. I'm blown away by who this character was in our history. But then to be doing some research on the book and then suddenly find out that days before he's assassinated, he's in Birmingham, he's in Smethwick. And not only is he there, but our family, Avtar Singh Joel, is the one apparently driving him to Oxford for the famous debate that's available. It's an hour long on YouTube. And Uncle Avtar is like, no, we brought him, and he was one of the seniors in the Indian Workers Association. And the reason that he said, we brought him over just like the Jamaican community did. They said the reason we wanted him there was because we were being told that you cannot go into the main bar in the pub. You had to be in one of the back rooms, and we were being segregated. And so this is the mid late 60s. And so for me, to be able to share that there was this 2 to 3 degrees of separation, not 6. And the fact that you have this pivotal man who blindly followed another and a tradition until he goes to Mecca and goes, oh my God, there are people with red beards and white skin here who are going around the Kaaba and they are Muslim. I got it all wrong. And then to not only feel you got it wrong, but then to admit it publicly, I got it wrong. And now I've got to change. To me, that's all about education. To me, that's all about the kind of role models we need in society. Yet, who are ours? We all know Harry's, DNA comes from probably the greatest Punjabi Sikh, Shahid Bhagat Singh. That to me is one of the greatest stories of an individual whose writings you read at the young age of 22, 23. It's like, what? He wrote this? This kid was that deep? And then for him to be like, no. my life sacrifice is about changing the life for millions. Millions, and it will have an impact. It's a role model. So we started to talk about the Kardashians and role models. So what are we thinking about role models? Who and what should be our role models today?
And people who are engaged in life passionately. Why? Because they'll be real. And if they're real, people will connect to the realness. And if it's quirky, but something about that quirkiness connects, it'll start, it's like Bane. They call it Ginika, right? It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because it keeps attracting. It's not that it's spreading out, it just keeps attracting. But there has to be a real element to it, because I think what happens is that 5 to 10% at the bottom that are meant to be suppressed, systems are there to suppress them. Everything that you've been talking about, the instability, the food safety, this is systematic. It's not just the mindset. That mindset's required for people to lose humanity and to turn a blind eye. But it's intrinsic.
The system's not broken, it was built that way.
It's built that way.
The system's not broken, it was built that way.
Yeah.